Picture a narrow crack in a granite cliff, just wide enough for the Atlantic to squeeze into. A wave rushes in, the air inside gets trapped and compressed, and then it explodes back out in a burst of spray that can shoot more than 40 feet into the air. Locals call it Thunder Hole. And it's just one of the ways this small stretch of the Maine coast keeps surprising people who think they already know what a national park looks like. This is Acadia National Park, on the coast of Maine, mostly on Mount Desert Island, with outlying pieces on the Schoodic Peninsula and Isle Oo. It protects roughly 50,000 acres and nearly 64 miles of coastline, threaded through more than 20 mountains that rise almost straight out of the sea. Despite its size, small by national park standards, Acadia pulls in about 4 million visits a year, putting it in the top 10 most visited parks in the entire country. Inside its borders, 27 miles of historic motor roads, 158 miles of hiking trails, and 45 miles of roads built exclusively for horses and carriages. Acadia didn't start as a federal land grab, it started as a gift. A Bar Harbor summer resident named Eliza Homans made the first big donation, 140 acres that included the Beehive and the south side of Champlain Mountain. Other wealthy summer residents followed her lead, and local trustees began stitching the donated parcels together into a protected landscape. Two men pushed hardest to make it official, George B. Dorr and Charles W. Eliot, alongside the philanthropist John D. Rockefeller, Jr. In 1909, Dorr built an octagonal tile-roofed spring house at a place called Sieur de Mont's Spring and carved the Sweet Waters of Acadia into the rock beside it. He eventually handed the federal government 5,000 acres of donated land, and in 1916, President Woodrow Wilson used that gift to create Sieur de Mont's National Monument. 3 years later, in 1919, it became Lafayette National Park, the first national park anywhere east of the Mississippi River, with Dorr as its first superintendent. It wasn't renamed Acadia until 1929, after a further land donation on the Schoodic Peninsula. The National Park Service still calls it the first national park ever assembled entirely from land donated by private citizens. Rockefeller wasn't done. Between 1913 and 1940, he personally financed and oversaw the construction of those 45 miles of carriage roads, broken stone roads about 16 feet wide, engineered with a crowned surface so they'd drain properly. He paid for 16 of the road's 17 stone bridges, each one a completely different design, faced in granite quarried right there on the island. When the roads were finished, he gave them to the park. Acadia's coastline looks the way it does because of a genuinely deep timeline written into the rock. More than 500 million years ago, mud and volcanic ash settling on an ancient seafloor got compressed and cooked into what's now called the Ellsworth Schist, the oldest rock in the park. About 450 million years ago, an ancient landmass called Avalonia slammed into North America. Then, around 420 million years ago, molten rock pushed up from below and cooled into the Cadillac Mountain granite, the pink granite that makes up the core of Mount Desert Island today. Where that rising magma cracked the rock around it, it left behind what geologists now call the shatter zone. Then came the ice. According to NPS's own park geology page, glaciers reached their maximum extent here around 18,000 years ago during the Wisconsin glaciation. The NPS Geodiversity Atlas puts the regional maximum closer to 21,000 years ago, with ice about a mile thick sitting on top of what's now the park. The two NPS sources don't fully agree on the exact date, but both describe the same event. That ice was heavy enough to push the land itself downward, and as it melted, sea levels around the island swung wildly. Ancient beaches formed nearly 300 feet above today's shoreline, before the land rebounded and the sea settled into the drowned, jagged coastline you see now. You can still read the glacier's fingerprints directly in the bedrock, long scratches and crescent-shaped gouges left by rock dragged across rock. One of the clearest examples is a peak called the Beehive. As a glacier slid across it from north to south, the ice smoothed the north face and tore chunks off the south face as it passed, leaving a lopsided shape geologists call a roche moutonnées. Look for the same shape at South Bubble and the Porcupine Islands. Start with Cadillac Mountain. At 1,830 feet, it's the tallest point on Mount Desert Island, and NPS frequently points to it as the highest spot on the entire U.S. Atlantic seaboard. People have been coming to its summit for well over a century. The U.S. Coast and Geodetic Survey installed a station up there in 1858, the Brewer family built a hotel in the 1860s, and a cog railway hauled tourists to the top starting in 1883 until it closed in the 1890s due to debt. During World War II, there was even a radar station up there. Today, you still need a timed vehicle reservation to drive to the top in summer. Then there's Thunderhole, from our cold open, best experienced 1 to 2 hours before high tide, when the waves have the most force behind them. Sand Beach is the park's one real stretch of continuous sand, which is unusual for this coastline. Most of it is rock. And it has a secret. In January 2024, back-to-back winter storms tore away the sand and exposed the wreck of the Tay, a 19th-century Canadian lumber schooner that wrecked here in 1911 and has surfaced and been reburied by the shifting sand every few decades since. Jordan Pond is a glacially carved lake framed by twin peaks called the Bubbles, and at its south end sits Jordan Pond House, tracing back to a farmhouse George and John Jordan built in 1847. The original building burned down in 1979, and the one visitors see today on the same spot dates to 1982. And don't skip the carriage roads themselves, 45 miles of Rockefeller's handiwork, crossed by 16 of his hand-financed stone bridges, or Bass Harbor Head Light, authorized by Congress in 1858 to help ships avoid a dangerous reef, and handed over from the Coast Guard to the National Park Service as recently as July 2020. Acadia's peregrine falcons have a genuine comeback story. Cornell University began reintroducing them here in 1972, releasing captive-bred chicks onto cliff ledges. Between 1984 and 1986, 22 chicks went out at Jordan Cliffs, and in the spring of 1991, the park recorded its first successful wild nest since 1956. By 2021, 3 breeding pairs were nesting along the Valley Cove, Jordan Cliffs, and Precipice Trails, and every pair fledged 2 chicks that year. The park's Peregrine Falcon Watch program, running since 1994, drew more than 4,500 visitors during its 2021 season. Then there are the beavers, North America's largest rodent, weighing 35 to 60 pounds, able to hold their breath underwater for about 15 minutes. NPS calls them a keystone species. Their dam building creates the wetlands that other species depend on, and losing them from a landscape can trigger a much wider ecological collapse. Most visitors start at the Hulls Cove Visitor Center off Route 3, typically staffed from early May into late October in a normal year, with winter information shifting to the Bar Harbor Chamber of Commerce. Check NPS.gov for exact current year dates before you go. The Sieur de Monts Nature Center and the Acadia Gateway Center in nearby Trenton are 2 other seasonal hubs worth knowing about. For camping, there are 4 NPS-run campgrounds, Blackwoods and Seawall, the 2 larger options on Mount Desert Island itself, Schoodic Woods, out on the Schoodic Peninsula about an hour from Bar Harbor, and Duck Harbor, just 5 lean-to sites on remote Isle Oo, reachable only by boat. 90% of sites at the island campgrounds release 6 months ahead, on the 1st of the month at 10 a.m. Eastern. And once you're on the island, you don't necessarily need a car. The free Island Explorer shuttle has run since 1999, with 17 propane buses covering 7 routes that link hotels, campgrounds, and the park itself, seasonally from late June through mid-October. If you want to get away from the Park Loop road crowds entirely, there are 2 real options. Duck Harbor Campground on Isle Oo is about as remote as Acadia gets. 5 sites, no road access, boat in only, booked up to 7 months in advance. Or head to Schoodic Peninsula, the only part of Acadia that isn't on Mount Desert Island at all, with 7.5 miles of hiking trails through spruce fir forest that see a fraction of the traffic the main island does. Acadia's mountaintops are visibly changing. About 16% of the vegetation on the park's summits has disappeared in recent decades, as roughly 6 additional inches of rain and snow have fallen each year over the last century, on top of more frequent intense storms. That's a real threat to the roughly 145 plant species growing up there, including the rare alpine blueberry. Park staff and partner organizations are testing more climate-resilient plantings and setting aside cooler refugia microclimates where sensitive species can hang on. There's a newer threat in the forest, too. Hemlock woolly adelgid, a tiny invasive insect that kills eastern hemlock trees, was first confirmed on Mount Desert Island in May of 2020. It matters beyond the trees themselves. Hemlocks growing along streams keep the water cool enough for the invertebrates and cold water fish, like brook trout, that depend on them. And on the water side, while Acadia's lakes currently test with excellent water quality, several other lakes across Maine have seen unprecedented, costly, harmful algal blooms over the past decade. Researchers have since built a bloom risk scorecard for Acadia's own lakes and folded regular monitoring into the park's existing water quality program. One quick note if you're planning a visit soon. As of this recording, there's an active health advisory against swimming specifically at Sand Beach Lagoon due to elevated bacteria levels. Not Sand Beach itself, but always worth checking current conditions before you go. From a 500-million-year-old shoreline to a beach that keeps hiding and revealing a century-old shipwreck, Acadia packs an enormous amount of geology and history into roughly 50,000 acres of Maine coastline. Next time, we're heading west to the jagged, glacier-carved peaks of Glacier National Park.